Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Our title for today's webinar is called Harnessing One-to-One Analytics for Better Lead Performance. We're excited to have you here as we dive into the top 3 concerns that we've had for our one-to-one setups and also how to address them effectively. Additionally, we'll be covering how one-to-one analytics from Lead Prosper can transform your lead generation optimization strategies. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, please use the Q&A feature below for your questions, and we'll address them at the end. Also, this webinar is being recorded and a replay link will be sent to you as well as posted on our YouTube channel. Let's dive in. In our last webinar, we covered one-to-one setups in depth. If you weren't on that one, please feel free to check out our YouTube channel. Since then, we've talked a lot about the alterations and fixes pushed in preparation for the FCC's looming deadline this month. I'm curious, Ross and Garrett, talk to us about the top 3 concerns that we're currently seeing with these one-to-one setups.
Cool. Yeah. So it's definitely been quite a few concerns we're seeing working on our clients, one-to-one setups. I think there's definitely 3 of them we're going to cover. The first one I've been seeing quite often is there's buyers out there that are not requiring phone or email on the ping. And that is troublesome because if they're not, requiring phone or email on the ping, there's a chance that lead can become a duplicate. And we don't want lead suppliers or lead generators to waste that impression and show that offer to then get the lead, submit the lead, and then it dupes out. So if you do see that, if you are a lead generator or supplier and you do notice phone or email are optional, I would, you know, make them required, talk to your buyer too, or pass them and see if they do send a dupe response, and talk to your buyer and make sure that if you do pass phone or email that they are providing a proper response if it is a duplicate, because again, you don't want to waste that impression on your site and possibly, sell that or think you're selling a lead and then it just fails out due to dupe.
Would you recommend the same
Yeah.
for our Lead Prosper users that are also, in this case, technically buying from third-party suppliers and are the buyer?
100%. I think it's simple I would go with probably phone, a little more accurate these days. I would require it for your suppliers to send it to you, but also you still want to talk to your buyer and do some testing, or maybe shoot us a ticket. We can help you test it to make sure that your buyers dupe, that they are checking for dupes on that ping, even if they don't have it required. We've seen both to where it is optional and they do a dupe check if you provide it. And then we've seen other buyers where if you provide it, they're not really doing a dupe check on it. So definitely something you want to be thinking about and talking to your buyers if they're not requiring it or if they're not giving you those dupe responses on the ping.
That's a fantastic first concern, and definitely seeing it come up a lot. Garrett, what's a secondary concern that you may have regarding some of the one-to-one consent setups that we've had?
Yeah, I think the biggest issue that we are running into from the back end as we're building out these buyers is the ping and the post responses. Because from your buyers, you're expecting to get back a list of bids. The issue that we're seeing is that there is no sort of general consensus on what data to actually pass through or how they're passing it back on the post response. And the problem here is that when we built, we're seeing that as we built out our system, we built it in a way where we were relying on the buyers to pass back certain information. Specifically, people were looking for TCPA names, but you also need things like bid price. You generally a unique ID would be helpful, like a bid ID. We found workarounds for that, but that's just on the bid response. When you're getting back on the ping, the problem that we're also seeing, which is one of the biggest problems right now that we're trying to work out, is on the post, not getting back any data on the bids that were sent back on the post, that whether or not they sold, whether or not or if they failed, why did they fail? There's no information. The only thing that we're seeing in some of these bigger end buyers or these buyer setups is it looks just like a general ping post response, where on the post you get back, all you see is a status, a price, and a unique ID. The problem here is that when you're dealing with multiple bids from a buyer, we have no way of indicating what bids were actually sold, what the responses were for each of those bids, what the overall price is for the what you would consider the lead that you sold, whether it's split across multiple end buyers. So there's a lot of very troublesome post responses and ping responses that we as a LMS have to figure out workarounds with, but overall need to be addressed industry wide because no one's going to be able to use that data. If you can't sell, if you're getting back bids and you're selling them, and then you have no idea what the response is on those bids, how are you supposed to optimize your campaigns? So they're basically leaving the suppliers in a very odd position, or even just the users who are trying to sell to them in a very odd position where they can't optimize because they're just stuck with a yes or no in terms of all the bids being sold or not. So that's one of the biggest issues we're running into. And we've been fortunate where we've been able to reach out to certain aggregators, certain buyers, and get conversations started with them to push them in the right direction. But, it's few and far between. We really need to see better communication if we want to make this work as an industry.
That is the question, right? Many people are looking for the solutions. Have we found them, and how do we collectively get towards a solution as we come up to this deadline?
Yeah, I mean, communication and the ability to work together is what's going to, make it work best for everyone. And, I know Ross can speak on this more, but like some aggregators and some buyers don't even want to start the conversation. And that's one of the most frustrating things because, if you're using an LMS like Lead Prosper, it's all very relatively straightforward. It's when you're dealing with buyers of proprietary backend systems where they're buying on their own system and they're not fully equipped for this. We're running into a lot of friction, and especially with some of these buyers who don't even want to talk to us to try and come up with a resolution. So it's honestly the hardest thing we've been working with, especially as we get closer and closer to this, deadline.
Completely makes sense. And thank you for elaborating on kind of the work towards a solution. It sounds like that we've had a lot of our users going back to their buyers. We're having a lot of success with a couple alterations, but ultimately there's still some room to grow in that area. Now that we've covered some of the top 3 issues that we're seeing, we're really going to dive in the conversation regarding one-to-one analytics and why we developed this feature in the first place. Garrett, can you talk to me about, just in general, what is one-to-one analytics?
Yeah, so with one-to-one analytics, we had to almost rethink the type of metrics that we were going to store and run reports on, because the overall, I don't even know, like landscape of what metrics are needed in order to best optimize now, with the consumer being in control of the lead that's being sold in the end. We had to almost think about it and revamp and add metrics as if it's almost like an ad platform. This is going to include, the bid pricing, the positioning. Another big factor to take into account now is going to be things like average ping time, average post response time, all different types of metrics that are going to be best used to optimize your campaigns moving forward, whether it's on the supplier side or whether it's on the buyer side. We've also had to think about the idea that as you start getting multiple bids back from buyers, the TCP entities that they're returning are really the end buyers. That's what we have to display on the front end. And we had to revamp the entire analytics to take into account the different TCP entities and tracking data for that, so that you can break it down almost at another nested level, going down even further. So you're not even just talking about buyers now, you're now talking about the end buyers that the buyers are talking to, pinging and whatnot. So it has to take it down a whole other level. And we've added in a ton of metrics that we hope and we've seen be very useful to our users in terms of this optimization.
I love that. I have a couple more questions before we get in with that. But Ross, did you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I want to jump in because there was like another problem we didn't touch on too much that kind of goes hand in hand with analytics. And what that is we've seen a lot of networks and aggregators not following a simple ping post methodology, and that's creating problems for our users and the front end forms and the softwares that they're using, and it's leading to massive confusion. There's some buyers that are returning snippets of JavaScript that embed an ID or do something else. There's others that redirect or want to redirect the consumer from the O&O, which can cause other problems where maybe that owned and operated, user doesn't want to, lose their consumer on the site, and they want, to monetize more or push that consumer through another path. And when these buyers or aggregators are not following what I'd say most of the industry is, again, a simple ping post methodology, that can also skew analytics. And it's hard for us, as Lead Prosper to, if the page gets redirected, we don't know what happens. Did that consumer convert? And these are, again, this is a massive concern for me. And like Garrett mentioned before, we're trying to reach out, to these networks and aggregators, other buyers. We've been somewhat successful leaning on our clients to get that conversation started, but we're happy to work and talk to anyone, buying leads on a one-to-one consent and explain to them simpler ways to do this, and, just make it better for everyone out there just trying to generate these leads in a compliant way and sell them and be able to optimize their campaigns.
I love that. And it sounds like just walking through some of the past support tickets that we've had here at the Lead Prosper. I'm curious, when it comes to those supplier conversations, are you open to continuing to work with these suppliers, even setting up calls, things like that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we're open to any form of communication that can either help our users or help us even as an industry. I mean, we've talked about this, I think, on the last webinar, where Ross and I have been very vocal trying to get kind of a communication going across the industry. And I think a big reason for a lot of these issues with rolling out the new sort of campaign types for a lot of these buyers is there was no communication. And as we reach out to these buyers and we bring up issues to them, they start to think, these edge cases that occurred, they start to realize that they overlooked it. And a lot of times we've been very fortunate where the developers have been very quick to put out a solution and get things rolling again. But overall, communication is the best thing we have going for us as for us as a SaaS, as an LMS, but also as an industry. We need to get the communication going so that we can talk about these issues, get them resolved, and kind of set a sort of global standard that everyone can work with.
Awesome. Before we dive into our demo of one-to-one analytics, I had a couple questions, just in general, again, regarding the one-to-one analytics. And I think perhaps maybe, Garrett, if you can share your screen, it might be helpful just to have a visual behind some of these questions. We talked about that if we look into our Lead Prosper platform, it's now a separate page of reporting for one-to-one consent. What was the reasoning behind that?
Yeah, I can talk about that. So it really came down to, with the new one-to-one campaign, it is a brand new campaign type. And anyone who's been a Lead Prosper user in the past, when you set up a campaign, it was very straightforward. You set up a campaign, and if you wanted it, by default, it was direct post. And if you wanted it to be a ping post exchange, all you had to do was basically just adjust a single toggle switch on it, and you could turn it into a ping post exchange. And what that would do is everything would be done inside the single campaign. With the new one-to-one campaign type, it's very different system. And we realized you can't just migrate over. We had to create a whole new campaign type. And with that new campaign type came a brand new set of analytics. And instead of trying to put everything together, as people start moving away from direct post and ping post, we decided, let's just build an entire new dashboard for the analytics and go from there. So that was what we found to be the best approach towards the analytics. A lot of older direct post and ping post analytics just didn't even, we can move them over, but they're not even the biggest concern with the new analytics. So we wanted to make a fresh dashboard that everyone can get used to, review the reports, and start getting a better understanding of how to use these new metrics moving forward and not busy them up with your older campaigns and whatnot.
In your opinion, and I'll direct this towards Ross, what frequency should users be checking these, and kind of what actions are associated with that frequency?
So, I mean, if it was me, I'd be checking almost every hour on the hour, just because I'm a little, maybe OCD or crazy. But these analytics and insights are valuable. If you're spending money on an ad spend or buying media, there's a lot of money at stake, and you want to make sure that everything's working properly. So if your ping post ratio is low or your average bids per ping are low, then these might be signals to you. If your leads are failing or your pings are failing, you're going to want to check your logs and see why they're failing. Maybe there's malformatted data. Maybe your buyer, made a field required and they didn't tell you. And all of these, as time is ticking, you want to make sure everything's buttoned up the best it can be. So me personally, I'd probably be checking every hour, but as much as time will allow you until you feel like everything is running smooth, I would keep an eye on analytics. I would check your logs. Any fail, I would look over the response and make sure, if it's data related, you fix that quickly. If it's not, if there's an ambiguous response, I'd reach out to your buyer and share that log with them and say, hey, why did this lead fail, or why are my pings failing? You have to constantly keep that conversation open with your buyers and your suppliers, to make sure everything's running smoothly, because things change and things happen, and if a day or two can go by and you can have a massive loss of revenue, and that's not fun.
Sounds like now that we're moving towards a place where a lot of individuals are hosting their own owned and operated sites, that the responsibility and the frequency becomes greater. Is that right?
I would think so, because it's all that responsibility is on you and your site, your front end, how you're handling the data and how you're reacting to your buyers in the back end. So there's definitely more responsibility here. And,
Yeah.
simply put, you're pinging out to your buyers, and then based on those ping responses, you're now displaying offers, and you only have that, I don't want to say one shot, but it's
There's a
not like
limited
it is
window.
now. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. There's a limited window of opportunity to sell that lead, and you want to make sure everything's buttoned up and running as smoothly as possible. Otherwise, if you lose that opportunity, that lead is lost, and you don't
Absolutely.
want to lose that lead. Yeah.
Garrett, I have a question for you, and this will be just one of our final questions before we go into our demo. If you have a one-to-one campaign, so we have a couple new campaign types, or one new campaign type, which is our one-to-one campaigns, but we also still have our main buyers in there, like a ping post, direct post. So back to the original question, say you have a one-to-one campaign, but you have a ping post buyer inside of it. Would you be using the one-to-one analytics, or would you be using that ping exchange?
So we have our ping exchange analytics, but those really pertain to campaigns that already exist that are on that sort of older campaign type with direct post and ping post. And so you can't really use that. That's more specific to the campaign type itself, not about the buyer. So when you're dealing with a one-to-one campaign, you want to really, you're only able to use the one-to-one analytics. Nothing will appear in the ping post analytics, unfortunately. But one thing to keep in mind that I want to always articulate is that the overall functionality between a ping post campaign and a one-to-one campaign is the same, where there's a ping and a post, and there's going to be data that you need to break down for the ping versus the post. It's always going to be two action. So definitely keep that in mind. So you can bring a lot of the sort of metrics that you look at from a ping post. If you're used to working with ping post exchanges, a lot of the metrics and things you use to optimize are going to be in the one-to-one analytics. So you can build off of that. And with the new metrics that we're including, you could just get even more granular and more in depth.
Makes sense. Let's say that you're testing a supplier out, and we see a lot of individuals, especially our users, that are doing test posts from their landing page and those webhooks. Where would you find leads that ping but not necessarily post when you're trying to test and figure out if things are running properly?
Okay, so that's kind of like a twofold question. The reason why I say that is because by default, when you have a supplier in test mode, that's something I want to keep in mind is if you have a supplier in test mode, something to think about is the idea that we had to take that into consideration. And so on the ping response, when a supplier is in test mode, we're actually sending back like fake generated data, dummy data to be used so that when you're testing it, you can still see how the data is going to come back in without having to just copy and paste. But that data doesn't exist anywhere really. So you can't go in. But when you have suppliers, you have them live and you're sending data in, and you're trying to send data in, for example, and it's not coming through, the first place I always recommend checking is the ping logs. So the easiest way to get there is when you're logged into your account is to go to logs here and then open up ping logs and you select your campaign. And from here, you're able to see all the pings that were sent in. And then if you start seeing issues with like error, let's say number of windows has wrong value, you can open this up and you can dive in and you can see what the problem is here, and debug and see what figure out why the lead isn't coming in. That's the first thing I would suggest. The idea is that to think about it is a ping is sent in, but if that ping is never accepted into your campaign or even is rejected for any other reason, you won't see that in the analytics. It doesn't appear because it's never technically been ingested in. So we like to make sure that you can go in here and check. Another issue, something to keep in mind is with the new one-to-one campaigns is there is an update and a new URL for both the ping and the post. So I always say like check your URLs first. If you're sending to the old URL, the lead will never get in. The URLs have changed. It's very minimal, but keep in mind, always check your specs and make sure you're sending to the right URLs, and then check the campaign ID, supplier ID, and the key. So that's always the first thing. If you're not even seeing it show up here in your logs, that's what I would check. Yeah, so that's the first thing that's basically the first thing I would do when it comes to checking these things.
We find a lot of our users, that's one of the first questions they ask when they're testing is, where can I find these to troubleshoot? So thanks for answering that. Well, it's one thing to talk about one-to-one analytics in general, but it's another to see it in action. Let's go ahead and walk through a live demo with Garrett and Ross over the one-to-one analytics.
Yeah, I'll dive right in. So what we did here is the dashboard looks very similar to the way the analytics used to be. But now you see we have suppliers and buyers. You can break it down by the different campaigns. So if you have multiple one-to-one campaigns, they'll all appear here and you can close them, open them up. On a very top level, you have your entire campaign specs or campaign analytics, very straightforward. And then when you open it up, you get a breakdown by supplier and buyer. But one of the biggest changes is we've added in this TCPA buyer section. And what this does is this basically creates metrics that you can use for each individual buyer plus TCPA name combination. And the reason why I'm emphasizing that is because you might be dealing with different networks or different aggregators, but their end buyers could be the same. A big example, a really good example for that is like insurance. You really have like eight to 10 specific carriers, and they get you'll get the same TCPA name back for any buyer with the same TCPA name. And you'll want to break it down by buyer plus TCPA name to see how those different TCPA names are affected across different buyers and whatnot. So that's how it's broken down. There's a lot of new metrics that we added in. So I'm going to go through each individual section with just some of the key metrics that we've added. And we have documentation that goes over all the metrics that we've added. But from a supplier level, the two metrics that I recommend the most to everyone to check for is your average bids per ping, and then also your ping post ratio. And I know Ross can dive more into the ping post ratio a little bit, but I did want to talk about sort of the idea of where like the average bids per ping would come into play. So when your supplier sends in a ping, you as your campaign will ping out all your buyers, get back a list of the bids, and then send them back over to the supplier. But something to keep in mind is that we have the buyers are the ones who are returning the bids. And so if you're getting a very low amount of average bids per ping, as opposed to the other suppliers in your campaign, there might be an issue coming up. So one thing to look at is go into those leads and then check to see what the buyer responses are. There's two things to look out for. One is to look out for any responses, errors that might be due to a misconfiguration. And then the other thing to look out for is, two things to look out for. One is filters that you may not be using. So let's say, for example, your buyer is always failing out bids where the state is Florida, for example. You might want to put a filter into place on some of these buyers to take that into account. But then also, we're seeing a lot more now in responses, the errors being related to DNC checks, dupe checks, or a lot of the times we're seeing a very generic message like high risk, and they don't want to work with that. So when you have a very low average bids, you can dive into that and start looking into why they're only getting back a certain number of bids to see if it's an issue from the supplier side where they can fix something, or on your buyer side with the misconfiguration and whatnot. Yeah, then Ross, I don't know if you want to dive into the ping post ratio stuff. And
Yeah, so ping post ratio is pretty simple, but it's a very powerful metric. This represents the number of accepted pings compared to the number of accepted posts. And this is one I'd be monitoring, very closely. If you're pinging out to a buyer, a lot, and you're actually sending in these posts to try to, sell that lead, and your ratio is very low, there's something wrong there. And that's like a key signal for you to be analyzing and checking quite often, because if your ratios are off or they're super low, maybe you're losing to someone else out in the marketplace, or, there's a lot of potential possibilities there, but it's a great metric to keep an eye on and just give you, again, that key indicator that, either this is working really well or there might be a problem, or it's kind of a starting point to start checking your logs and reaching out to your buyer and communicating and talking about, I sent you 1,000 pings today, and out of those 1,000 pings, I have 100 posts, but only 2 of them were accepted. Like, what's up here? And maybe it is a data issue, or maybe I don't know. There's so many variables, but again, it's a great conversation starter, and it's a key metric I would keep an eye on.
yeah, for sure. Thank you for that. I mean, yeah, the basically what you're going to be looking out for, and something I always tell everyone, is just look for any anomalies. That's a great way to start breaking down where you want to look, and then what to look for. And then, with the whole idea that on the supplier side, something to keep in mind is like, you're now using this data to if you're an O&O, you're sending the data back to yourself, or you're sending it to your third-party vendors. But the idea is to send them data that they can work with, and then also give them sort of based off metrics that you see, sort of reasoning to either why there might be issues or how they can improve their side of things. When you're dealing with a ping response from our system as a supplier, we actually send back a number of metrics that they can use as well on the supplier side that are outside of our analytics as a whole. For example, we send back, like average, not even average, we send back the response time. The reason for this is, from a supplier side, they can take that data, they can analyze it, but if they can also use logic on their front end that says if a ping response time, or if a response time for any of these bids is over a certain amount, don't show it, because it might affect the rest of the lead moving forward, because it directly affects the loading time for the consumer on the landing page. So that's another thing that we tried doing, is we're now sending a lot more data back on the ping response, and some of that data is coming back from these analytics and what we're recording. So I definitely wanted to point that out as well, because a lot more data on the supplier side is just going to only help with conversions and troubleshooting and whatnot. The next section where we added a ton more metrics is on the buyer side. So supplier side is one thing, but on the buyer side, we've added a ton more metrics. Some of the key ones that I talk about with some of our users are the total bids from the client and the total bids sent to supplier. So what that means is you have your bids that are returned whenever you ping one of these buyers, but then you also have your total bids sent to supplier. And what that means is, anytime that you have filters on actually give me a second, I'll pull it up. So when you have a one-to-one campaign like this, we've added in a number of filters and management settings that you can use to limit the bids that are being sent back and control what's being sent back. And there's multiple ways that we do this. It could be a minimum return bid price. It could be the bids order. We could be removing duplicate bids. We can be, there's also sell to one TCP entity only. And the reason why I'm pointing this out are these are all factors that play in to what data is being passed back on the ping response, and that could directly affect your total bids sent to supplier. And why I point that out is when you have a number of bids being returned from the client, but only a very small amount of those bids are being actually sent back to the supplier, it may be time for you to tweak some of your settings. Whether it's adding in filters because of some of those bids can't be returned, whether it's adjusting the settings on the campaign level to take into account, these sort of discrepancies and kind of balance it out a bit better. There are a lot of new features. There could be confusion when setting them up. So we want to make sure when you're looking at these numbers, you understand that there's ways to tweak this to improve those metrics. So that's just one set. Another thing that we talk about is average bid from client and average bid sent to supplier. One thing that I always try to point out is we're now moving from when you're on a supplier side to almost like a bid placement and an ad management, or almost like an ad setting, where the bid price returned by the client could directly affect their placement on the page. And where that comes into play is when you're dealing with ad placement. We've seen data from people who've been running this for a few months now, where the number one spot on the page is going to get a 50% conversion rate, and then it drops significantly to 2, and then even more so 3, 4 placement on the page. So something that I've been telling people to look out for is almost like ad placement and manipulation, avoiding things like you have a buyer who's coming back and they're putting a super high bid on the ping. That price could directly affect where they stand in the bid list, and they could be thrown up to the number one spot. And then on the post, I've seen some crazy things where their bid price on the ping is actually not the same price they're buying the lead from you for. So they're doing this sort of manipulation. That's something to keep in mind moving forward when looking at average bid from client and average bid sent to supplier. So yeah, I mean, these metrics.
Yeah, that's a great call out though, Garrett. You gotta, like you just said, I'll simplify it. Your buyers can be bidding high because they know they're gonna get that placement. Their offer will be seen. And whether or not that lead sells, they're kind of exploiting the system to appear on that site and get the consumer's eyes on their offering. So
And also,
definitely, keep an eye out for
keep
that.
in mind, and also keep in mind that this may not even be directly correlated to your buyer in particular. Your buyer may not be the one that's doing this. It might be their end buyer who's returning a bid price that's even higher. So you have to sort of break it down and look into these very fine details to be able to best figure out where the issue might lie. So these are sort of things to look out for. And I don't want to call it fraud because I don't really believe it's fraudulent, more so like gaming the system and manipulation to look out for. Another key metric that's really important moving forward is going to be attempted leads. So what attempted leads are attempted leads is anytime you send back a bid to your supplier, the consumer has to then consent into the lead. And then once that lead is consented to, or that bid is consented to, that bid is sent back on the post to our system, and then we post to the buyer. Attempted leads is literally the amount of posts that were actually sent to the buyer, which means the consumer consented to being contacted, went through the whole flow, and then that bid ID came back on the post from the supplier. So the reason why this is important is you're able to see, when you have a very low number, you want to be able to look against those attempted leads, and then you want to compare them against like your sold ratio. So you can see how many posts were actually sent to the buyers versus how many were actually sold. And what you want to see is almost a 1-to-1 ratio. You want to see 100% because you want to assume that the leads that are being sent, or the bids that are being sent back by the consumer and go into your posting your buyers, they should be overly qualified. That means that they should already be duped against. They should already be gone through filters and everything like that. So there's very little reason why they should be failing on the post. And that's where you want to take attempted leads and then compare it against some of the other metrics that we've added in, such as sold ratio. Another sort of manipulation or gaming that might be taking place is going to be buyers or end buyers who are accepting the pings and then failing you out on the post. And the reason for this is when you send a post to the buyer, there's two things already have happened. One, the consumer agreed to being contacted by the end buyer, but now also on top of that, you've sent the post with the full lead data to your buyer and they failed it, but they still have that data. So there's going to be you might run into situations where you have an end buyer. And when I say end buyer, I'm removing the buyer inside of Lead Prosper, and I'm thinking more so like their end buyer or whatnot, where they might be gaming the system and basically not paying you for leads when they already have the full lead data and technically they have the consent from the consumer. So they can technically take that data and call out on it if they wanted to. So when you see a number of attempted leads and then you see a very low sold ratio, first thing you want to do, you want to go into those leads and check what the error response is. If it's a misconfiguration or if it's a valid reason, fix it on your end. Try to fix it on your end. But if you're starting to see where it's just like a failure and they're not even giving you a good reason, reach out to their buyer immediately. Try to figure out what's going on, because there could be shadiness going on, or there could just be, maybe there's a misconfiguration on their end. But you want to fix these, because ideally any lead that comes in that's attempted, in this case, like for example, right here, we have 30. This number should be 30 attempted leads and 30 sold. You don't want it, that's ideally what it should be. You should already go through all the pre-checks to make it so that this lead is as golden as possible and should be selling. So that's one of the bigger metrics I tell people to look at. And then you have your total pings per buyer, things like this. More so about the pings and posts, but actually from a supplier side, the biggest thing on the buyer side that I recommend looking into is average ping response time and average post response time. Not so much post response time, because that may not directly affect your consumer, but the average ping response time is very important, because the higher this number is, that's the amount of time that we're waiting on the buyer from Lead Prosper is waiting on that buyer to return a response. And we don't send a ping response back until that has completed, because we don't have the data. So when you have an average ping response time that's very high, and ideally in today's world, you shouldn't even be taking more than a second to get a response. There are situations where you run into issues where you might be pinging a buyer and that buyer has a number of buyers and one of their buyers might be taking a long time. Whatever it is, when you're talking about a really long ping response time, that directly affects your consumer on the front end. And a way to think of it is like if you're going through a form now, and a very common practice is when a consumer, instead of hitting submit to send when they're at the end of a form, they hit a continue button, and then that's when the ping takes place to your campaign. You have to display something to let the consumer know that there's an action taking place. When it goes past 4 or 5 seconds, your consumer immediately is going to drop off. I mean, you might see them close out of the page. They might think the page is broken. They might refresh the page. Whatever it is, it's breaking that sort of flow. And so when you have a very high average ping response time, you want to work as best as you can with your buyer to reduce that. There also are going to be situations where your buyer may not be responsive. In those cases, we've actually added in a new feature, to the buyer setups, where you can have a buyer, let's just open this up, and basically on the ping and the post, you're able to now directly control the HTTP timeout for both the ping and the post, and it could be and or. So if you don't want it to last more than 3 seconds, you can come in here, set the timeout to 3. And what it'll mean is after 3 seconds, we will time out that ping, and then we'll be able to send a response back to your supplier. So that's how you can use these metrics to kind of optimize and also help on the front end. And then same thing so that's kind of like the buyer metrics that we've added. And then obviously all of these metrics kind of translate into the TCPA buyers as well. So you can also look at a more granular level, like I hate to use fraud because I don't want to call it fraud, but if anything looks out of place for a buyer, you can now go down to TCPA buyer here and break it down per TCP entity and kind of see where the drop-off might be taking place or where issues might be occurring, so that you can reach out to your buyers and start figuring out how to fix this. And things to look out for would be like, super high average bids, anything out of place. Like we have ping post buyer here where their average bid is $15 when everyone else is between $5 and $6. And that might be directly, that could be a TCPA name by itself and not all the entire buyer itself. So something that you can also look out for to help optimize. And then you also have the ability to kind of like break down revenue, bids sold, bids unsold to these end buyers, I want to call them, because these are like, the end buyer that your buyers might be selling to and whatnot. So also helps you optimize to figure out where you can make, optimize profits and whatnot going forward. So that's kind of like the overview of some of the more advanced analytics that we've added in. Again, we're still using a lot of the analytics that people have been using for years now with ping post, but we've definitely expanded it significantly for the new one-to-one campaign type. I think that's it that's all I got now for the sort of the analytics. I don't know if you had any questions you want to dive into.
Well, absolutely. And just as a friendly reminder, if you do have any questions, please feel free to put that in the chat. We'll be sure to answer that. And while we're doing that, there were a couple things that I'd love for you to elaborate on in terms of some of the things that you've had. In terms of those buyer names, so under the TCPA buyer names and the TCPA names, how are those generated? Like when you look at your general setups, how are those generated?
Yeah. So that data can come through a number of ways. By default, you have a static value. You could always set it to whatever it needs to be. For example, you could have a ping post buyer, but they're only returning a single bid, and that bid is the end buyer. So you can work on it that way. An example is, if you're working with, let's say you're in legal and you're working with a direct law firm, they're not going to return back a name on the ping. You already know what the name is. So always confirm with them and then set it that way. But if we go into, actually I already have a buyer set up here. So this is a ping post buyer. When you have so one thing to keep in mind is with the new one-to-one campaign, if you have a direct post, an email or store lead buyer, you have to set a static value for the TCPA name, because the reason for that is the only time we ever reach or even trigger that action, that delivery method, is after basically the ping has taken place. The filters for that buyer will come through when there's a single action in particular. So when that happens, you're always going to get back a response on the ping that this buyer is available, but we will never even engage the action until the consumer has consented to being contacted or consented to that buyer getting the lead. And that's when the action takes place. So we don't get any data until the post is basically already taking place. So in these cases, what you'll see at the bottom here is we have a customized API response, and you can set this to static, and you can enter whatever you need the name to be. Same thing with email and store lead. You get down to the bottom here, you have a value key and store lead, the same thing. You just enter this. That's where the name is going to come for these buyers. So it's going to be a static value. Now with ping post and one-to-one, it gets a little bit more complicated, but not terribly. So with ping post, you have the ability to either do a static name, or you have the ability to pull it from the ping response or the post response. Ideally, it's going to be, if you're dealing with the post response, you're still more than likely going to need to set a value. I would almost set a static value because you want that name to be displayed on the ping response in the bids so that your buyer can work with it. But if you're talking about the ping response itself, you might get back a single bid, and in there comes the TCPA name. So all you would do is you would basically set the value key. So what that means is where in the response they're stored, what key has that information. You set it here, and then we would dynamically pull it and then insert it in the bid response. So that is how you would do it with a ping post. That's where the TCPA name comes from. And then to get even a little bit even more complicated, when you have a one-to-one buyer, by default, you're setting up your TCPA bids and configuration. So what you're doing is you're basically setting in this section right here, basically where whether it's a single bid or multiple bids, there's going to be an object returned, ideally an object returned in the ping response. And that's where we're going to then pull in each individual bid, go through it, parse the information, and create our bids on our side. So what you do here is you basically set a mapping for that so that we know what object to look for in the ping response and where to get that information for. So you want to get the name, the ID, and the price key. And that's where you would get the TCPA name by default. There's also the ability to pull in even more. Maybe you have a different name you want to display other than the TCPA name. For example, actually a great example is with insurance. Sometimes you have a carrier, but then you also have a buyer name and they might be different. For example, you might have a carrier name returned that is Geico, but your end buyer is Geico of Asheville, and you want to decide what you want to change. Maybe you want to include both of those in the response. So what you can do here is come down to customize API response. And then from here, let's say TCPA name 2, you can actually go, we have 5 options here. We have ping response, post response, and static value, similar to ping post. But now we have ping response and buyers and post response buyers meta. And what this actually does is this goes through each individual bid that's returned and extracts the information from those individual bids because it might not be the same. So it almost brings it down another sort of ring down the ladder. So you have like your entire ping response, and then now you're able to go through and set the value based on the individual bids inside of that ping response. So you can get a lot more granular with that name and then pull it out from here. And then when you're setting this up, we have our API response preview, and you see now we have 2 TCPA names coming through, and you just have a better way of sending more data through that you might need to use. So it's complicated, but it's not. You can get the name from either static value, the ping response, or the actual individual bids in both the ping and the post. So that
and I really like that feature. I feel like we try to future proof a little bit, because if people, we haven't seen it yet, but if people decide, or buyers decide to start sending back images or other text or specific TCPA text or anything that they want included on that page, we now have the ability to grab that from the buyer that you're working with and pass it back to your supplier or to your own, front end.
Another great example
Yeah.
is like redirect URLs. In some industries, they want to pass you back to a live chat. They're going to send back that redirect URL, and then you can use this feature to pull it from each individual bid, so that you're just, when you get the true redirect URL, so that you can pass it back to the supplier and they can display it for the consumer. So it gets you can get you go a whole other level down into the individual bids and extract that information. Again, it's all on a buyer level, because not all buyers are going to return the same information. So you need to customize it per buyer, but you can really get into very specific data that's being returned and whatnot, and be able to pass it back to the suppliers.
And it sounds like, let's say, for example, someone seeing redirect URLs or some type of meta that's different than a TCPA name in their analytics. It's probably due to the mapping on the TCPA name in the one-to-one buyer.
Yeah. And again, it's a great way to kind of like troubleshoot if something looks off and you may not understand why. Go through your analytics, look at what the TCPA names are coming back as. If you're seeing description text as your TCPA name, you map something wrong. Or you may not have mapped something wrong. Your buyer may have set up their mapping wrong in their response, and they might be sending for the name, they might be including description, and for description, they might be returning name. It's something to keep in mind. We haven't seen that happen, but it's an edge case. It could happen, and it may not be an issue on your end, but you might need to reach out to your buyer and have them fix it on their end. So these are things that we're trying to basically give every imaginable way for you to be able to troubleshoot your campaigns, and the new analytics and all that stuff is really what's going to make or break, I feel like, success moving forward, is taking the time, going through it, looking for discrepancies, looking for anomalies, and breaking it down even further and getting an answer and a solution. So yeah.
What about for example, buyers that are straightforward? So like direct post, email, store lead buyers, where do those TCPA names come in for the analytics?
Yeah, it's just from the static value set. So by default, when you're in a one-to-one campaign, when you're in a one-to-one campaign, you're creating a buyer, because you can still use direct post and email and stored lead. We are always going to need a TCPA name, no matter what, that needs to be displayed. So by default, you have to have a value in there. And you'll see if you open up direct post and you scroll down to customize API response, if I don't put a value here and I go to save, it throws up an error. It's a required field. We need something, at least a TCPA name, for our to pass back on the response. Another thing to keep in mind if you want to even get more like, I don't know, if you want to go more like macro with it, is we need to send this data back for your suppliers. And if they're working with an LMS, they are going to need this data as well to be able to properly populate, collect the bids and whatnot. So we had to decide if there was one value that had to be sent back as TCPA name, and that's what we're working with. Because that's the end buyer name, and realistically, that's the end buyer name, and that's what is most important when you're collecting consent for the consumer, is getting them to consent to that specific TCPA, DBA name, and so we have to include that value.
Thank you. I am curious, we talked a little bit about ping response time and a little bit about how it affects the user journey. In your opinion, either Ross or Garrett, I'm curious, like at what point or like what ping response time do you think it's worth to have a conversation with your buyers? So like a max ping time.
Yeah, so Garrett kind of touched on it, and I believe it too. Like I think, you know, under a second should be realistic, but if you're seeing 3, 4, 5 over 5 seconds, I would be worried because your front end, depending on how you built it, is going to be behind the consumer, if that makes sense. The consumer is going to be at a point to where they're waiting for the ping response to come back, and that's not a good sign. You don't want that consumer drop off. You don't want to, you know, and I also want to touch on it too, that we have that metric attempted leads. If your attempted leads sold are high or low, and the ping response time is high or low, those are good ones to kind of look at together. If you have 0 attempted leads, but your average ping time is 5 seconds, you should probably cut that buyer off. He's adding additional time that you're waiting. You know, on the flip side, if you have, you know, ping response time of, let's call it 5 seconds, but you have a lot of your leads are being attempted to be sold there, then you should investigate your post logs and look into your leads and talk to your buyer and try to, you know, you know something good is happening there. You have a lot of leads attempted to being sold, but the ping response is high. That is a great conversation starter with your buyer to talk about, hey, how can we optimize this? Maybe it could be one buyer in their chain who's buying nothing, slowing them down that we have no clue about. So
Yeah.
I would say more so than ever, these average response times, attempted leads sold, all these metrics we're talking about are more important than ever. Because and today, all the lead processing happens in the back end, the consumer's not waiting. But as of next week, you can't have your consumers waiting, you know, too long, or they're going to drop, or like Garrett said, they're going to refresh, think there's a problem, and you want to avoid that as much as possible.
Ultimately,
Yeah.
seems like a disruption in that user experience. Garrett, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I actually just shared. So when you're in the lead modal and you're looking through like an individual lead, you can also see, if you wanted to, you can break down the response times we included in this lead data, in the lead modal data. So when you're troubleshooting and you're trying to figure out if, you know, when you're trying to just determine what looks off, definitely look at the request times. I mean, you see here, these are taking a split second. These are like ideal. These are the best response times you can get, because that means that there's a very low number of like friction when it comes to getting the lead data back. So yeah, I think looking at these anything 1 second is hard. And the reason why I say that is because even when you think about, if you're buying from a user who's on Lead Prosper, if you're a third party vendor, you're trying to sell your leads to a Lead Prosper user. Our system works where we have to collect all of the bids before we send anything back. And you know, it could take more than 1 second, because you're now, as the lead prospect user, you're waiting on everyone's responses. That's why being able to set the HTTP timeout on the ping and the post is really helpful, because you can now limit that per buyer so that you can drop that overall response time down significantly. So if you set it to 3 seconds across the board, any buyers who are taking more than that, you'll drop it and you can then send back, you get a response back to your your supplier in a very reasonable time. But, you know, to come up with an exact number is very hard. I don't have the data. I'm not split testing what works on the front end, so I can't give you an answer there. But, you know, as fast as possible really is what it comes down to, because as you got to think about it from a consumer's perspective, if they're sitting there watching a little windy wheel on your page taking 5-6 seconds to go, they're going to think something's broken. They're going to drop off. They're going to refresh the page. They're going to exit out, and then that lead's dead in the water. And it it's a waste. And you need to be able to optimize the front end just as much as you're optimizing your campaigns inside of lead. Like, you have to be able to optimize better now for the front end. It's just the way it is. Before, it used to be a form submit, when the ping post used to work, and the way that it technically still works today is you fill out a form, you hit submit, and that's the end. You don't know what happens on the back end because you don't need to wait on any of that data. You just get moved through and get pushed through to either a thank you page or the next flow based on whatever the post response is. So you're looking at ping response time. If you're moving people through the flow and you're bringing them to another step in your flow afterwards, post time is going to be very important as well. Average post time. You might have a really low ping response time, but if their post response time is taking even longer, that could also throw off your consumer and move them. Let's say you're trying to move them to additional offers. They might drop off if they're sitting there waiting for the submit to finish, the final submit to finish, and it's taking 15 seconds. The ping response, the ping times might take even less, might take half a second, but the buyer's response time on the post is taking 15 seconds. It's going to affect the overall flow. And so these are things that need to be taken into consideration a lot more stringently moving forward.
So it sounds like it's not even just ping time, but it is post time, and both of those are really they are affecting the user journey. Does that apply to like redirects as well? When it comes to looking at the average post time, is there a similar question? Is there a max post time, just like there is a max ping time?
Yeah, I would say if you're waiting, if you're working in finance or a vertical that has redirect URLs or other information you're waiting to show on the thank you page or final submission, if you need that secondary data, whatever it is, and you're waiting again 10 seconds, it's just not a good look for the consumer. So I would keep an eye on both. I think ping response times I'd rate them as number one importance. And then number two, depending on your flow and how your form is working, the post times, can come into consideration depending on what you're trying to do. For most verticals, the post is kind of going to happen in the background. It's not going to matter as much. But if it is a redirect URL or some type of live chat redirect or anything you need for a thank you page, that could definitely affect the consumer journey and have a negative consequence if those times are more than a couple, 4 or 5 seconds and up.
Yeah. And especially if you're using it if you're, the form submit could only be one step of your flow. You might want to move them to, I don't want to call it remonetizing, but further monetizing them down the road, whether it's static offers or an offer wall, but it's all based on the response from the post that can directly affect your ability to move your consumer through those flows and directly affect revenue. So, it's very dependent on your exact situation or even your supplier's exact situation, and how they have their flow set up, but things to keep in mind.
Absolutely. Well, I just want to thank everybody for joining today's webinar, and also thank you, Garrett and Ross, for taking the time to kind of explain our one-to-one analytics and how we can use them to optimize our lead performance. As a reminder, this recording will be emailed to you. It'll also be put up on YouTube. Our team is additionally available for follow-up questions. So if you are a current customer, please feel free to put those in the chat. If you're not a current customer, please feel free to reach out for us a demo. We'd love to meet you and show you more about the features that help with this one-to-one consent in the future. We look forward to growing with you. Have a fantastic rest of your Wednesday.
Bye, guys.